Smoke break over. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Oh my God, you all are tired. Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Lahore Bajistan, and I will be your moderator for our next panel, which is very sexily titled Queer Theory Panel. I do want to say I'm really grateful that there is a panel on queer theory. I think queer theory is art. Queer theory is really fucking weird and therefore takes all these loops and logics that look like beautiful things, and I'm glad that art is being understood as queer theory and queer theory can be understood as art. And I'm excited for all of you to be here and hear these four incredible panelists in conversation with each other and myself. And I think that it's important that this panel is at Fatal Love because there is so much queer labor that has gone into making South Asian art. And I think it's an important acknowledgement of queer and trans folks who have been laboring, people who've been living on the margins of gender and sexuality, as well as caste and religion, who have been making work and who often are invisibilized or whose labor is tokenized. So for this panel to happen, I think is an important way of staging works and memories as well of particular kinds of labor. We have four wonderful panelists, three of whom will offer prepared remarks, and then the five of us all together will be in conversation about all things queer and fabulous. Although queer doesn't always have to be fabulous, as you will learn today. Although I am. So speaking first will be Alpesh Patel, who is the director of the MFA in Visual Arts program and associate professor of contemporary art and theory at Florida International University, Miami's only public university. And his book, Productive Failure, Writing Queer Transnational South Asian Art Histories, was published on June 30th, right? What is that, Friday? Yes, come on! By Manchester University Press. Listen, the book is a really fucking hard thing, so, like, am I allowed to say that? Yeah. Great, okay. It's really fucking hard to write a book, so, as Ronak and I were just talking about. Following Alpesh will be Natasha Bissinath. Natasha received her PhD in art history. She filed her dissertation, what, 2 days ago? Like, this is like, we are all winning, really. Received her PhD in art history from Cornell University, and this fall will begin as a postdoctoral fellow and visiting professor at Haverford College. Also offering remarks will be Ronak Kapadia, who's the assistant professor in gender and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and has secured a book contract with Duke University Press for his book, its forthcoming book, Insurgent Aesthetics, Race, Security, and the Sensorial Life of Empire. And then joining the conversation will be Alan D'Souza, Associate Professor of Art Practice at University of California, Berkeley. Alan D'Souza's work has had solo exhibits at the Art Gallery, at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and San Francisco Camera Work. A round of applause. I love that you do everything I tell you to. This is going to be a great panel. So without further ado, Alpesh Patel.
Alright, just want to put that timer on. First of all, I'm so excited to be here. This has been a really fantastic convening, and I'm meeting people that whose work I've read, whose artworks I've seen, whose artworks I've written about, but I haven't sort of met them. So it's been quite wonderful in that way to make these connections. I want to talk today about the book project that was just published on Friday, and it's called Productive Failure, as you can see there on your screens, Writing Queer Transnational South Asian Art Histories. It really came out of this, interest in what would it mean to actually write a transnational South Asian art history? What would be the objects of evidence in such an art history? And it was this kind of concern that was more about curiosity, and also another concern that was more about the fact that this history isn't being written. There are so many artists whose works have not been sort of anthologized or canonized. So I felt like there was this need in terms of at least making visible certain practices. But how to make those practices visible? And again, like what kinds of things could count as transnational South Asian? Queer theory has been really amazing and useful in kind of thinking about how to mobilize and think about this kind of project. Judith Halberstam's idea of productive failure, that is sort of the title of my book, has been foundational. The idea that we can essentially succeed through another route that's normally seen as being a failure. I'll add to that I'm sort of moving beyond this idea of productive failure to something that's more akin to queer exhaustion. And I will talk a little bit more about that later, what that means, and why I think that has been so important as well. All right. So I'm going to walk through some of the chapters and give you a sense of flavor of what it is I'm doing. Obviously, I'd love for you guys to engage and read the text. But so much about what I'm doing is about writing. And the writing is a craft and practice and a doing. And how through writing I'm discovering things. So this presentation in that sense has a very different function, you might say, than the book. One of my first chapters is about authorship, because it seems like, okay, if we're going to write a history about transnational South Asia, that it's about genealogy, at least on one level, and that's an important foundational part of what that would be. And that often means authorship, where the authors are from that are creating these works. I was really interested in looking at all of the criticism that's available now from the late 1970s to the present on the artist Anish Kapoor. He's one of the few artists of South Asian descent in the West that has not only a lot of visibility and success, but there's a lot of writing around him, discourse. And that is kind of, was really wonderful for me to kind of poke my head into and see how he was framed over the years. So it was fascinating, like, in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, he was often written about as an Indian artist. That started to change as post-colonial theory became more in vogue, and he was then a British Asian artist, so this was the language that was often used to talk about him. At some point, he was just an artist. There was really no discussion about British Asianness or Asianness at all. And more recently, he's self-fashioned himself, actually, as Indian. He had an exhibition in India not too long ago. It was one of his first there. And it was also it was interesting because he was able to fashion his identity, and that was quite, I think, powerful in terms of agency. The entire chapter is kind of a negative critique. It's like, well, this person is writing about Anish Kapoor, and they're not able to talk about him in this light. This person's writing about Anish Kapoor, but they're missing this whole other angle. So then how do you write about Anish Kapoor? I mean, this is where I came to. How am I supposed to write about this artist that's complex? And I kind of came up with this idea that the first most important thing is that I need to foreground my own authorship, and to make that a part of the discussion of what I write. And this is something that'll make more sense in a book than a short review. But art histories are often presented as being objective, as being without question on some level. So inserting myself, my biography in a way, is to allow the reader to already see that it's a subjective sort of performance that I'm a part of. Okay, so sort of moving from authorship, one of the most basic ways that we can look at something is to look at form, look at colors and lines and shapes, and that's often thought of, again, in an introductory like art history course, how you begin to understand what's in front of you, is to just describe and look. So I wanted to begin to look at work just through form as my beginning kind of portal and entry point, and then to see where that kind of took me. I was particularly interested in looking at this theory by David Getze on queer form, something that he writes about with Jennifer Doyle, in which he writes the form itself, these colors, lines, and shapes, are more than that they're actually embodied. And what we might be thinking about more is one's body's engagement with a form and how that can be redeployed or reshifted. The example that Getze gives is taking Andy Warhol taking like a library and putting all of the books of their spines faced inside. And that, that small shift changes the way the viewer engages with the work. So this chapter kind of, very strangely, I think, for me at the time, ends up being about Cy Twombly, of all people, and as well as Natvar Bhavsar. Now, I was particularly interested in looking at their work, which I think formally connect, in terms of their interest in abstraction, from the 1960s, a period when Natvar had first come to New York, and when Cy Twombly was essentially being thrown out of New York because no one liked his work at that particular moment in time. So this moment was kind of interesting to kind of think about these two artists through this idea of queer form. I'm just going to leave that there because I want you guys to read the book, obviously, and find out more about this. Right? The next sort of chapter, again, it's almost like I'm, in my contemporary art classes, I'm talking about frames and how different frames produce different kinds of meanings, and it's important to be very clear about our frames. So a frame that I thought was very important was subject matter. All right, just looking at the content of what's in front of us and using that as a way to kind of look forward to what could be in South Asian art history. And that was fascinating because it led me to a number of artists that are white, essentially, or black. They are all mobilizing South Asian signifiers in their work. And so I was interested again in looking at the work first through subject matter, right, what's on the canvas, let's say, and then kind of going back and looking at their authorship as well. And I write this idea of writing as a racial pharmacon, really drawing on the theory of Derrida, where he looks at this idea of a pharmacon being both a poison and a cure. And I wanted to show through these works how these artists really show both sides of the equations, you might say. They're not solving necessarily problems, they're bringing them up, and yet they're showing potentially other modes of thought. These are stills from the work of Stefan Dean. That piece was called Pulse, and it was based on a holy festival. Stefan's really interested in color and the possibility of color and what it can do. This is work from Mario Pfeiffer, who's based in Germany, and did a work that very much was, on some level, when I first saw it in New Delhi, was about his experiences when he was first there, and it looked like a horrible travelogue. It was incredibly problematic to me. And then, so there was that angle, but then there was much more. He, I think, was very aware that he couldn't just talk about his experiences, that there's this whole discourse around white subjects coming into South Asia and visualizing the histories, that he created this huge reader and brought in all kinds of artists to talk and really kind of provide incredible amounts of context. So this became, for me, part of the artwork, that the work wasn't just this video. It was also this reader, and together they formed a kind of an interesting practice. Adrienne Piper is another artist who's actually 1/8 East Indian, so she was the only artist within this group that had some connection, you might say, to South Asia. And Hinde Wiley, and his interest, his particular body of work when he went to South Asia, actually. All right, since I'm sort of running out of time, what I'm going to do is just quickly say that the book kind of moves from deconstruction and negative critique towards more generative readings and new ways of thinking about how to write an art history. And this often involves autoethnography. It involves practice-led research, or me working with artists, putting together shows. than me kind of looking at the responses of those shows as a way to kind of again further theorize what I'm doing. All these things became kind of part and parcel of where I was going. But I was moving away from, again, this kind of a negative position, I would say, to something more, this is generative. And I want to end just by saying that this kind of writing that I want to do is very akin to what Marcia Mescamon, an art historian in England, calls affirmative criticality. It's a way not to be mean-spirited when you're writing criticism, but writing criticism in a way that has a kind of ethics to it as well. And that was incredibly important to what I'm doing. So I'm going to just leave it there, and I hope very much that you will go to Manchester University Press's website, or Oxford University Press's website, and read the preface of the book, which is available for you to look at. And also, I'm hoping that this will generate conversation again. Like, this is not over. It's hopefully a beginning to a lot more transnational South Asian art histories being written, because we need them. Okay.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Jayshree and Verna, for organizing, for answering all of my last-minute emails. I'll start today by doing a very kind of conventional art history, reading a conventional art history paper where I'll hone in on a single work of art from Fatal Love, and offer a reading that speaks to the gist of my project, which is one that emphasizes playful aesthetics in the visual culture of difference. I turn to form as a way to address the fatigue and malaise that has developed around identity as an organizing principle, which I believe has occurred in part because of art historical focus on content from historically invisibilized groups, which is, of course, a good thing, but has come at the expense of an in-depth analysis of form. That is to say, the artist's aesthetic labor, right? What we call the work. And in shifting the conversation from the politics of content to the politics of form, I aim to shift the conversation from visibility projects to an aesthetics of irreverence that disidentifies with majoritarian forces in place. In this way, my emphasis on play is a queering of the dominant ways in which art history has approached and historicized the visual culture of difference, including art from the South Asian diaspora. So, my main case study, New York-based, Sadia Rahman has just completed her MFA from Ohio State, exhibited in Fatal Lab in 2005. And I want to say, I was not living in New York at the time. I was still graduating from my undergrad at McGill, and so I actually do approach this, my encounter with Fatal Love is inevitably through the archive, and so I really do approach the show as a contemporary historian. So Lota's Stories has been generally understood as an oral history project, and today I want to flesh out some of Rahman's other motivating factors, namely her attention to play in gathering and disclosing such stories. I'll also analyze her installational choices that ultimately undermine the conventions of museum display. So Lota's, does everyone do any? Lota's containers you fill up with water and you wash yourself with, as opposed to toilet paper or as a complement. It's commonplace in South Asia and the Middle East. And often immigrant populations will have transported this hygienic practice with them. However, symptomatic of assimilative pressures, many transition to toilet paper and feel discouraged to use lotas, especially in public. Rahman's installation picks up on these anxieties, focusing on, quote-unquote, a secret society of, quote-unquote, closeted lota users. who refuse to cross over. Those are quotes by Bushra Rehman, Sadia Rehman's sister and a writer in her own right. For the duration of the paper, I will refer to Sadia Rehman as Rehman, and I'll refer to Bushra as Bushra so as to not confuse. So upon entering the bathroom of the Queen's Museum, museum visitors expect a break from the curated gallery spaces, and yet whether waiting in line or washing one's hands, patrons are reminded that they are still, to their surprise, engaging with fatal love. So you have some images here of the installation. I'll show you some others just so you have a sense of what we're looking at. So they're kind of nuzzled here between, they're nuzzled here between, in a niche between sinks. They're kind of suspended from the ceiling in these clusters. And here you have, so this is what one would encounter as you enter the bathroom, either bathroom. And this is a close-up, which I'll speak to in a second. So she converted these functional objects into a work of art by covering the lotas in collaged paper, cut up from water bottle labels. The significance of these labels signal how water bottles are used as makeshift lotas, as lotas in disguise, if you will, since these water bottles are more inconspicuous and thus more ideal, especially for public use. The makeshift quality of these labels breaks the smooth surface of the original lota, and so you have a kind of anti-aesthetic here that may or may not mirror the crassness of the in-situ location in the bathroom. Rehman's collage objects were accompanied by an audio recording that loops stories by local users. And some narratives are funny, others were riddled with shame. Many interviewees were nervous, but also excited about sharing these stories. In a way, there was this feeling of being freed in some capacity. Bushra notes how the profound shame felt by the interviewees surprised her alongside the measures that they would take to hide their lotas from their friends, from their coworkers, from their live-in partners even. Quote, this is Bushra, "Where did we get this shame? How did it sink so deep into our skin?" End quote. In an interview, Rehman herself recalls feeling shameful when installing the work of art itself in the bathroom. When all of her colleagues are invited to engage with the white cube, her inclusion in Fatal Love instead made her question her success as an artist. And yet, the exclusionary quality of this installation actually confronts and subverts the conventions of exhibitionary display. The nature and texture of the encounter matters. It is unexpected, jarring even, and it is this absurd encounter with the art installation in the bathroom that playfully challenges the overarching feelings associated with lota use in an immigrant context. In this way, Rehman's installation brings immigrant aesthetic discourse in conversation with respectability politics and the irreverence of bathroom practices. And while bathroom humor is commonplace, within the public imaginary, bathrooms have also been theorized as sites of irreverent desire and intimacy. To many, though, they are also sites imbued with a sense of risk, understood therefore as a highly regulated space, perpetuating strict binary notions of gender. The consequences for disobeying such socially constructed rules have been dire, especially for those whose gender expression is non-binary and fluid vis-a-vis the gender binary. And as an unmistakably awkward space as well, the bathroom is also not only where one uses the bathroom, it's where one misses the bowl, it's where one drops a tampon, it's where you run out of toilet paper. All of these mishaps are ultimately embarrassing, right? And perhaps embarrassment embodies that line between the shameful and the hilarious. And within a public bathroom context, when the goal is to be brief, Lota Stories asks the viewer to linger and loiter. Given the pronounced regulatory forces around cleanliness, the pull to assimilate is strong, alongside the pull to secrecy. And ironically, while washing oneself with lotas is in essence a more hygienic practice than using toilet paper, the internalized associations between all things unfamiliar and therefore all things negative run deep. However, I do not highlight shame here to dwell on the impact of the feeling, but rather to dwell on how the ridiculous act of coming out as a lota user, right, in these oral histories, upends the feeling of shame attached to the lota closet. In several personal narratives, community members share their deep sense of shame associated with the pressures of assimilation. Lota Stories offered a safe space for her participants where there's room to question and eventually laugh at their own feelings. And many had follow-up stories that would involve them mustering up the courage to come out in person to their friends and roommates and even the live-in partners as lota users. In one story in particular, a woman explains that she keeps a coffee cup in the bathroom for the sake of discretion, and even her live-in partner didn't know its purpose. And upon coming out in the artwork, she's inspired to do the same at home. At which point her partner reveals that he would return the cup to the kitchen every morning to drink coffee. Needless to say, this double revelation was accompanied by laughter and self-ridicule, a critical turn of events that diffused the shame around which the secret use of lotas revolves. The humor comes through in the coming out process, because in the big reveal, the irony and absurdity of being embarrassed about cleanliness becomes clear. Crucially, Lota Stories was inspired in part by a bad joke. Initially, Rahman aimed to pitch her artwork of handmade teacups sculptures for Fatal Love, an installation work that comments on how tea serving functions as a ritual and form of hospitality when two families come together to discuss the arranged marriage of their young adult children. However, with a dearth of display options, the curator and artist had to consider other spaces, and the bathroom came up as an unconventional but potentially creative option, an option in which the teacup installation no longer seemed appropriate. Facetiously, Bushra suggested installing lotas as fitting objects that would animate the space. And although Bushra's suggestion was only half serious, the next time they spoke, Rahman had not only developed an entirely new project, but one that, alongside her teacups, advanced an aesthetic investment in making and installing objects as microcosmic of immigrant community intimacies. An installation about lotas is appropriately site-specific for this allocated exhibition space. Yet Bushra's suggestion is funny, right? This is due, I'd say, especially in an immigrant context, lotas are inherently fraught with shame, yet through personal narratives, sculptural, ready-made form, and installational decisions, Lota Stories mobilizes humor to contest the politics of respectability around community bathroom practices. In an art installation and community oral project that recounts tales of assimilation pressures via the emergence of a secret society of closeted Lota users, the role of humor humanizes experiences that have otherwise conjured feelings of freakishness, despite ironically being about cleanliness. In this way, humor functions as the work's point of entry, that which makes the work accessible and potentially transformative. Humor also eases the coming out process and functions to undo deep feelings of shame associated with hiding one's practice, indeed one's identity as a quote-unquote closeted Lota user. Thank you. That's all I
have my Lota. Hi. I know you're all here for the drag show, so I will try to make this count. Is this the last formal presentation of the day? Oh, extra pressure. Okay, I will try to be a good, fierce closer then. First of all, Alan's going to be up here in a second too. Okay, so first, hearty thank you to all the organizers for their labor. Thank you, Prerna. And thank you to the inimitable Jayshree Abhishandani, whose lucid dreams and distant visions brought us all together this weekend. I love you. Okay, so I'm not an art historian. I'm not going to show you any images and do a reading. We'll do something weird instead. But, you know, we were asked to talk about queerness and what does queerness mean in relationship to what we've been talking about this weekend. And, you know, for me, queerness, it makes me think about what kind of world we are building collectively. And for me, that's that queer, feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-capitalist world, right? And so that's where I'm going to go today. So I've been excited by this weekend's call to reflect on the power and promise of South Asian diasporic visual art, an archive that's been central to my own intellectual and political development. But I have a counterphobic impulse, as I've said. I'm not an art historian. I'm not going to show you any images, but I want to linger on this weekend's call to broaden our collective toolkits for action. Enlarging our imaginations, of course, is crucial to the practice of freedom and the desire for lucid freedom dreams, especially amidst renewed state repression and violence. So to begin, I'm a queer cultural theorist of race, war, and empire in the US, and my primary research is motivated by the problems of policing and security. Security both as a political tool employed by the modern US state and its institutions, as well as the collective affective state of security experienced by racialized and sexualized populations moving between and within these sites. So I focus primarily on the aesthetics and politics of Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians in the US, knowing that those are, of course, not mutually exclusive categories, and globally. But I take my cues more broadly from the survival strategies, knowledge practices, and world-making acts of resistance of queer and trans communities of color. Right now I'm completing a book that examines the radical queer feminist imaginings and freedom dreams of the Muslim International, which is a constellation of transnational South Asian and Arab visual cultures that together comprise a fierce rebuttal to the dominant ways that we have come to think, feel, sense, and map the world in the context of contemporary US security violence and its permanent wars. Throughout, I'm inspired by how critical ethnic studies, intersectional feminism, and queer of color critique can amplify our investigations of the overlapping political crises of our time, including racist police violence, mass deportations, foreign and domestic wars, rampant economic inequality, resurgent nativism, and ecological catastrophe, fatal love. But of course, this language of crisis that I'm using suggests a temporal break, a turning point, a state of exception that is anything but to multiple communities already under siege in North America. If we look to the margins, we see that many populations, queer and trans people of color, women of color, immigrants, refugees from the global south, undocumented folks, Muslims, poor people, the homeless, sex workers, the imprisoned and their free world radical accomplices, indigenous people, crip and disabled folks, I could go on, all have been subject to perpetual crises and endless states of emergency. We can learn a lot about how to challenge the seemingly unrelenting nature of power and violence, as well as its differential dispensation, by listening to and learning from these communities and the aesthetic and political projects that they enact. So my first queer takeaway point today is listen to and learn from the margins. And I think we've done that collectively here over the weekend, thinking about how power is organized. So, in fact, I think this is one of the lesser noted but more appealing perks of doing time in the academy or the university or maybe even in museum settings as a queer theorist. The university itself remains a powerful, albeit imperfect and non-exclusive site from which to critique the uneven distributions of power, resources, and life chances in the social world, and to imagine alternative ways of organizing collective social life. But that project is rife with failure, as we know, as our institutions continuously disappoint us with endless power relations and inequities. We need only to think of those on college campuses, for instance, without protected status. Not just untenured junior faculty, of course, but groundskeepers, custodians, undocumented students, adjuncts, temporary workers, union activists, debtors, anybody perceived to be Muslim or Mexican. The needs of these disparate groups are vast in the here and now. Those in more powerful positions of status can do much to fund, support, center, or simply make space for these marginalized voices and then get out of the way. And I think we've seen some models of that this weekend too. So the second queer takeaway from my talk is, let's work to downwardly redistribute our multiple forms of power and resources to the broadest number of people possible. I think that is a queer act. So this intersectional sense of justice and struggle that I'm sketching here is certainly informed by Black, Indigenous, post-colonial, and women of color feminist and queer praxis. It's also informed by my reading of the late Stuart Hall and his colleagues at the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the UK in the late 1970s. Okay, I'm going to be another one of those guys who's referencing Black intellectuals to talk about post-coloniality and by default to be thinking about South Asians in relationship to post-coloniality. So Hall was a towering figure in Black British and post-colonial studies, whose writings offered a tart rejoinder to the obsession with representation that dominated avant-garde academic circles at the time. Hall argued with a patience that, looking back today with our endless social media wars, seems quite remarkable. That cultural representation, including all the art that we've been talking about this weekend, plays a constitutive rather than merely an expressive role in social relations. That means that it constitutes the meaning of the social world. It doesn't just simply reflect the social world as we see it, right? So Hall's writings went on to introduce what is now termed intersectionality, the recognition that the central issues of race, this is a quote, always appear historically in articulation, in a formation with other categories and divisions that are constantly crossed and recrossed with categories of class, of gender, and of ethnicity. Classic. So by now we take for granted this notion of articulated categories or framework of intersectionality, following Hall and Kimberly Crenshaw and many others, who formulated an understanding of race and class and gender and sexuality and religion and these other categories of social difference as co-constituted, that is, coming into existence in and through relation to each other. But their understanding of articulated categories went one step further to demonstrate the intersectional nature not only of social difference, but of culture, politics, and economy too. And economy is really a word I have not heard at all this weekend, which I think is interesting, because it's all about the economy, right? It's not. But these are still often construed as discrete spheres of inquiry, right? Culture, politics, economy, we think of those as discrete areas or realms of inquiry. But in their classic volume, Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order, Stuart Hall and his comrades argued that the problems experienced by advanced capitalist nations like Britain and the US in the 70s were not simply economic, but that the crisis of overaccumulation became a political and social crisis as well. That is, race and other categories of difference are at the heart of capitalist violence. This won't surprise many of you in this room. Governments scapegoat outsiders, whether that's undocumented Latin American immigrants, or trans and gender non-conforming people, or sex workers, or the homeless, or the seroconverted, and so on. The point here is that there is often an unseen cultural and ideological dimension to what is conventionally recognized as merely political or merely economic. So Policing the Crisis is this incredibly prescient text that provides a useful blueprint for addressing our ongoing crises of authority today, caused by police violence, mass and racialized incarceration across the US, seemingly permanent foreign and domestic wars, as well as struggles for global economic, environmental, social, and religious justice. To better understand issues of crime, of terrorism, of immigration, of populism, of white rage, of poverty, and so on, we need to adopt intersectional, interdisciplinary approaches to understand how seemingly distinct spheres collude in the production of dissident outsiders. So there again, the third queer takeaway is always work to understand problems at hand through an intersectional frame. That's, of course, axiomatic. I think this is where diasporic visual art plays a fundamental role in articulating and contesting issues of political economy and the unequal distribution of power, resources, and life chances in the social world. These concepts and approaches are central to my own research and the book project that I'm completing, which is about how contemporary visual and performance artists, many of the people in this room in fact, have exposed, contested, and reformulated the violent projects of US military empire and the recent global war on terror. My project shifts the transnational study of US war and empire in South Asia and the Middle East by illuminating what I term insurgent aesthetics. This is an alternative articulation of minoritarian knowledge produced by those populations most devastated by the effects of US global warfare. I ask how Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic multimedia artists in particular have grappled with the security state's use of gendered racial violence, including torture, detention, targeted drone killings, CIA kidnapping, and biometric surveillance. My main argument is that if we want to understand modern security politics, that is the present that we live in, especially the modes of surveillance, imprisonment, and death perfected in the war on terror, then we need an alternative approach to the maps of strategic thinkers and security analysts who've been telling us how we should look, think, and feel about the world. My reading of insurgent aesthetics in these works of South Asian diasporic visual artists is informed by activist traditions and social movements like prison and police abolition, immigrant justice, anti-war activism, disability justice, black liberation, all of which predate the war on terror and stem from earlier encounters with the US military, security, and penal regimes, which is, I think, is why it's so interesting to hear that Saucy was created in the 90s and what was happening in that moment and how does that actually inform the kind of work that's happening today. My point is that turning to the more expansive world-making knowledge practices of these artists, the artists are making worlds, not just dreams. They're making worlds that allow us for a moment of refreshment, an opportunity to rethink the politics of security and freedom anew. So finally, I'll close with the words of queer feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, who writes elegantly about the role of the killjoy, the feminist and queer killjoy, she says. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Ahmed, are you still with me? I can't tell. Okay. Ahmed critiques the depiction of feminists and queers, and perhaps the woke more generally, as unhappy, bitter Lota users who are killjoys because they disrupt other people's abilities to simply enjoy the things that are meant to make them happy. Killjoys wake us up. They are awakened. They are woke. I like Ahmed's concept of the killjoy because it reminds us that to be engaged in these downwardly redistributive activist struggles and social movements that are connected to the insurgent aesthetics that I've been tracing in my work and I'm mentioning here is a labor-intensive affective project. It is disruptive and disquieting. It affects us on the level of the body and the senses. Talk about queer fatigue, right? Alpesh, you were talking about. So she says, even talking about injustices, violence, power, and subordination, Ahmed notes, can mean becoming the obstacle as the one who gets in the way of the happiness of others. Your talk is heard as laboring over sore points, as if you are holding onto something, an individual or collective memory, a sense of a history as unfinished because you are sore. Indeed, we are all sore today. Fully living that queer killjoy life is about making room for the soreness in our bodies and minds. Building a killjoy toolkit is a survival strategy, a method of transporting ourselves beyond the here and now of global crisis toward a better, more just world that can and will exist. Thank you.
Some of us are sore because we were at the COP last night. Some of you have never been to the COP. It was an anal sex joke. Thank you. I love you, other drag queen.
Yes, thank you.
So we've asked a lot of labor of Alan D'Souza. So rather than asking him to offer prepared remarks, we just wanted to invite him into the conversation. Yes, you do. Would you like to start with that? Yeah.
I really just wanted to join in the sort of conversation, but I have a few points, and again I'll point you to the image. Like, what work is the image doing now? If you think of it, forget South Asian. Just think of this image now in relation to queerness. And so, what work is it doing, especially with this title? But and both of you alluded to that title. And then, what does it mean to end with rather than begin with queerness? Which is also related to what is it to not do the work of queerness? I also want to bring our attention to, can we do decolonizing work without also queering, or without queerness? Can decolonial work actually be done without the work of queerness too? And then the figure of the theorist, since this is a panel about theory and queer theory, it's something that sort of runs through so much with sort of art practice, the idea of the theorist as someone who thinks in opposition to someone who makes. And so artists tend to be positioned as makers, and even though we've seen artists up here all day and yesterday, the last 3 days, speaking and theorizing about the world and about their work and how their work functions in the world. And yet we make a separation to these are non-thinkers who simply make the work that gets thought through and theorized by others. That was kind of it. And then actually at the end I was thinking queerness as entertainment in opposition to the feminist killjoy.
Sorry. And that's actually a question I wanted to open up with, was moving from Ronak's talk into what you just said. Where is pleasure and pleasure in filth, in the laughter that was generated when you talked about drinking out of the lota mug, right? But like, where's the pleasure in filth and in public sex and in stickiness and in and what is the role of sex and bodies and desire in world making and in critique? You look ready, Ronak.
You know the answer to that, but it's a good question. Quickly to start about talk about respectability politics, right?
But can we also speak about these things in terms of artists that you're writing about or that you're thinking about, and not so actually point to the examples of who's doing it?
Yeah. Okay. I'll just briefly say first to Alan's point. Yeah. I think that that's why I call it the knowledge practices of artists, because they are theorists and archivists and historians, and we've seen that all weekend. The way that that division between maker and thought, idea maker and maker doesn't really obtain. And so I appreciate that the conference has done that work for us of thinking about the sort of promiscuous boundaries between a curator, a critic, an artist, and a theorist, right? Knowing that those are not discrete boundaries. And just to your point about the filth and dirtiness and pleasure, I think partly what queerness gives us is a critique of respectability politics, which was at the heart of so much South Asian diasporic organizing in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and aughts, right? So much of the feminist and queer impulse of that work, and there's a reason that the laborers who are organizing these conferences are all feminist queer radicals, right, and have been historically, is because those are the people who are doing the work of pushing back against boundaries around respectability within South Asian diasporas more generally. So I would just say that should be integral to the way that we approach thinking about South Asian diasporas, at least it is for me.
Yeah, no, you're talking about filth, and you're talking about whether we want to, how do we approach, you brought up the decolonial element, and I think that as we think through pleasure and filth, that we can have that conversation as a kind of, as a way to decolonize sexuality, really, where thinking through the respectability politics of some of the artists that I work on in my book project will attend to that as well. So, for example, I develop a theory around play, which I sort of demonstrate with one example here. And play is, for me, that is an aesthetic strategy. And as examples, I think of camp, I think of parody, I think of sarcasm, satire, these kinds of inherently tongue-in-cheek aesthetic strategies that allow us to question the status quo. And we've seen this come up in the past 2 days, right? This isn't a new observation, but I think that it's been a kind of under-examined emphasis. And so in the book, I try to sort of emphasize and put a spotlight on a particular political form that artists, for example, Sunil Gupta comes of age in London in the 1980s, and I write about one of his more contemporary series called Sun City, which is a series of, it's a tableau vivant of a protagonist, a queer immigrant character that's going through this bathhouse that's also called Sun City. And it's an actual bathhouse in Paris, and it has highly orientalized decor. And so there's this kind of, there's this highly sort of the objectification of race that is quite literally part of the architecture, the interior, that then this brown queer body kind of mirrors. And I write about the piece, the position, so he's navigating this space and he's, you could say taking pleasure, but I actually make the argument that the shots are so unconvincing that I have to pause and ask myself, is the main character actually taking pleasure? Or is this a performance of Asian asexuality? Is this an overperformance of Asian asexuality as a way to speak to desire as racially coded? And how this space, this highly orientalized space, doesn't actually, the series is often spoken about as a kind of celebration of sexual liberation, that, because this character has to come to Paris, something that is ostensibly not available where he's from in India. And so we would want to think through that premise, right? Available differently, perhaps. So how to navigate space. Thinking about pleasure and film through a decolonial lens, I think is useful.
I can't help asking actually about how you might see that in relation to Sun City, in relation to Looking for Langston. Knowing that Sunil, and this is an interesting relationship to blackness too, that Sunil Gupta is the set photographer for Looking for Langston. And so if Isaac Julian's film, and where Julian talks about his use of aesthetics, a kind of overproduction, as reparation, aesthetics of reparation. And so, how you might see Sunil's work in relation to that.
It's funny because the documentation of that video, the experimental video, is of course, the documentation that we have are Sunil Gupta's photographs. And there are these, there's the ambient lighting and still pauses, are quite aesthetic. They're beautiful shots, right? Of interracial desire between beauty, and there's what I think is, for me, that piece is mostly interesting in the ways that we have multiple histories coming together, where you have the kind of fantasy land, like the angels, and then you have the contemporary speakeasy, the queer Harlem Renaissance scene, a video, an experimental film that is occurring, that is done in the 80s, right? And so you've got these multiple histories, the poetry of Langston Hughes, right? And so you have these multiple queer histories kind of collapsing, and telling us that we can't actually map out a linear history for ourselves.
So queer relationship.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I also do want to note though that there's an maybe because this is I wanted to walk around it. But maybe because this is the last sort of panel here, that there's a capaciousness in each of your interpretation of what queer does. But I think one of the things to ask ourselves is also what is queer theory's limit, or what is it not do, or who have been the people who have had to push it, right, to do more than what it was expected to do. But I do love the sort of expanse that you've brought to queer theory. I see someone who has a question.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, in terms of queer theory, I think one of the biggest things that comes up in my mind as someone who is from Pakistan, who constantly thinks about Pakistan when I think about queerness, is how do we translate all of this? How do we form and make these conversations really, really, not only Hindi and Urdu, but Punjabi and Sindhi and Kashmiri and Bengali? How do we frame these words like queer? How do we frame these subjects and topics that have been, since since queer theory was made in about the, 80s, late 70s, you know more than me, how do we really make them attainable and accessible to people who may not be so well versed in these languages and phrases that we use?
I should have wanted to answer that question because I came across a very interesting situation connected to that. When I was in Eastern Europe last fall, that's where I spent a couple of months in Poland, and it was clear that a lot of the queer theory that we take for granted when in the West, first it had not been translated into Polish, but beyond that, even those that could read the English were not aware of it. They weren't in the libraries. The knowledge wasn't accessible. So, this is 2016. In Poland, more recently, it's had all kinds of problems, but before that, it was a poster child of how European nationalism had really moved forward. So I'm not so sure if it's important to translate queerness, but I think it's important to have that information there, and then those subjects there need to take that and make it their own, whatever it's going to be. And that's what I think is really critical. That makes sense. Just the access is so critical, not having that access.
Just piggyback to say quickly, if queer theory is this sliver of critical theory that emerged in the 80s and 90s in the United States, in the academy, and in activist traditions in the United States, and that's what we're sort of talking about, right? We're talking about the sort of exportation of queer as a language and as a theoretical framework in which to understand what? Alternative genders and sexualities globally? Well, of course, then it's important to pay attention to the local contexts, whatever those contexts are. Thank you for bringing up Eastern Europe, which you don't usually think about when you think about, queer context per se, right? But, the other, for me at least, the capaciousness of queerness, forget the theory part, right? The capaciousness of queerness is that it's an opening to think about alternatives, think about alternative gender, sexualities, to think about an alternative relationship to time, temporality, to alternative relationships to space, geography, to the archive, what should be in the archive, what should not be in the archive, the whole discussion we had about ephemera earlier, right? To me, that's a queer archive, the work that Sholé is doing, or the work that Chirag is doing, right? With Pardon My Hindi, that is a queer archive because it's about a repository of feeling and longing and memory and family that we won't see in a museum per se, right? So queerness, let's think of it in the most radical sense possible, and not pay as much attention to the limits, perhaps, with an understanding of its Eurocentricity and its et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I guess a couple of things, which applies to the idea of theory anyway. That I think there's always a variation of this question of how do we make theory accessible, and at the risk of sort of sounding sort of academic and elitist, we're kind of doing theory anyway, and we just might be operating on outmoded theories, and the work of theory is to generate new ways of thinking about the world as it is now, as opposed to how we learnt about it, 10, 50, 100 years ago, and operating on those ideas which are now outmoded for addressing the contemporary world. So, there's a problem just with the idea of making theory accessible. We're operating on theory anyway. And the other one is, if we're not doing queer theory, are we doing straight theory and functioning on that? Adding to it,
let's take another question for
I just wanted to go back to the point about art making as theory, because I'm an MFA director. That's something that I feel is really important. I tell all of the artists that what you're doing is theory. You're proposing questions, concerns. It's helpful to me. I'm engaging with what you have there, and through that I'm creating something else that can be reducible to the theory that I started with or the work in some way. So this is crucial, and I think there's still this binary around it, especially with the writing of art history, where there's these huge barriers. In most academic programs, the art historians are in a completely separate building from the art makers. And that tells you already right there kind of how they want to position these two particular fields. So there's something in terms of pedagogy that perhaps needs to change to make those kinds of conversations more accessible. Because I love telling artists that their work is theory. And you know, it elevates their work in a way that it should already have been elevated anyway, right? But and at the same time, I feel like what I do is craft. I'm making through my words. It's how I develop something. I have to do it, and then through that, I might get somewhere that I didn't think I was going to go. Just like an art maker.
So this is something that I do with my students. Instead of response papers, I ask them to make Instagram posts, and they're specifically with this idea that they're making that art is theory, and I also tell them that everything is an aesthetic, so that they don't feel constrained by being really good at memes or things like that. But I do like this. I do like pushing this conversation that art is theory, so that the academic panel or the queer theory panel belong here as in this conversation as much, and that the beautiful work that these folks make is art, and I read their work because it's beautiful, and so do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, definitely.
We do?
One last question. There was one there. Someone had their hand up.
Put your hand back up. Does the baby have a question?
Maybe we're done then.
Are you sure? They're amazing. They're so sweet. Cheshire, do you have a question?
No, but I do want to address the ways in which actually I've woven queerness through the entire symposium and the exhibition. You know, pretty much on every single panel, there was a queer artist minimum. And, you know, it was important to me that at least a third of the participants were queer. And then I chose to end it with you because I thought it would be really the most exciting way to end the conference. And we could segue into his fabulous performance right after. So today was really about discussions like about public art, about identity in Islam, about queerness, and the things that are more conceptual rather than discipline-based. So I just wanted to put that out there, that yes, we're bringing queerness into sharper focus during this panel, but it has been present through the entire thing. And one thing this is incredible to see all of you here. I'm kind of going to ask you to give a big round of applause because this is the last panel. And we're done. So here's just a couple of things. On that table, you will find the program that you have in your laps. I would encourage all of you to, especially if you're participants, if you're art workers, if you're academics, to take as many copies of those as you can. Because there are at least 65 amazing people's bios in that publication. And when you want to tell someone about South Asian cultural production, you can just hand them this publication. And this can be handed to other artists, to other curators, to journalists, to academics, but the purpose of this is really to act as some sort of starting point for you to discover who we are. So we are going to segue into Lahore Rajastan's performance, then we will have Faluda Islam's performance, and finally I would encourage all of you to hang about for the last hour, because this last hour is really the most crucial hour. It's when we can talk to each other about everything that we have absorbed and think about what we can create together. That's it. Thanks.